They called her Glass behind her back, this fragile-looking European girl who cried during combat training and froze up during live-fire exercises. What they didn't know was that Hadley Davis was about to deliver the most savage military comeback in NATO history, one that would leave her tormentors speechless and rewrite every assumption about what strength really means. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Ironforge, a NATO joint training facility nestled in the rugged terrain of northern Scotland. It was one of those perfect Highland days where the weather couldn't decide what it wanted to be, settling instead on crisp air and intermittent clouds that made everything look like a postcard. Hadley Davis stood at 5'3" and weighed barely 115 pounds. Her slight frame almost lost inside the standard-issue combat fatigues that seemed designed for someone twice her size. At 22, she had the kind of delicate features that made drill sergeants shake their heads in disappointment and fellow soldiers exchange knowing glances. Her accent carried hints of her Czech heritage, soft vowels that seemed out of place among the harsh barks and aggressive banter that filled every corner of the base. She'd been at Camp Ironforge for 6 months, part of an elite international training program that brought together soldiers from across NATO countries. The program was designed to create the next generation of special operations personnel, the kind of soldiers who could handle impossible missions in hostile territories. The selection process was brutal, the training even more so, and the washout rate stood at nearly 70%. Hadley was hanging on by a thread. The problem wasn't her intelligence or her dedication. She could field strip any weapon in the armory blindfolded, memorize tactical manuals in a single reading, and navigate complex terrain with nothing but a compass in her instincts. But when the bullets started flying, when the pressure mounted, when physical confrontation became unavoidable, something inside her would shut down. During close-quarters combat training, she'd hesitate at crucial moments. During live fire exercises, her hands would shake just enough to throw off her aim. Most devastating of all, during high-stress scenarios, tears would well up in her eyes, betraying the emotional vulnerability that military doctrine had no patience for. Her fellow trainees had noticed, of course. In an environment where weakness was currency for mockery, Hadley's struggles became entertainment. They started calling her Glass after she broke down crying during a particularly intense urban warfare simulation. The nickname stuck with the cruel efficiency that only military nicknames possessed. "Glass is gonna shatter again today," Private Marcus Webb would mutter to his buddies as they geared up for training. Webb was everything Hadley wasn't. 6'2", 200 pounds of muscle, with the kind of aggressive confidence that instructors loved. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the program and never let anyone forget it. "Maybe we should bubble wrap her gear," Corporal Elena Kozlov would add with a laugh. Kozlov was a Russian exchange officer, built like a tank and twice as tough. She'd grown up on the streets of Moscow and fought her way into the military through sheer brutality. To her, Hadley represented everything weak about Western softness. The instructors weren't much better. Sergeant Major Thompson, a career British paratrooper with scars covering half his face, would watch Hadley's struggles with visible frustration. During debriefs, his comments were cutting but professional. "Davis, emotional regulation is not optional in combat situations. If you can't control your responses under training stress, how do you expect to function when lives are on the line?" Major Patricia Shaw, the program director, was more diplomatic but equally dismissive. "Hadley has exceptional analytical abilities," she would note in her reports, "but lacks the emotional resilience required for high-stress combat operations. Consider reassignment to intelligence or logistics support." What none of them understood was that Hadley's emotional responses weren't weakness, they were hypersensitivity. She felt everything more intensely than others, processed threats and dangers with an acuity that bordered on supernatural. While her fellow soldiers saw targets and objectives, she saw human beings with families and fears. While they heard gunfire and explosions, she heard the subtle acoustics that could reveal enemy positions 3 buildings away. But in a military culture that valued stoicism above all else, emotional intelligence was seen as a liability rather than an asset. Crying during training wasn't interpreted as deep empathy or heightened awareness. It was simply failure to meet standards. The base operated on a rigid hierarchy where respect was earned through displays of physical dominance and emotional control. Morning briefings were conducted with military precision, assignments handed out based on demonstrated competence in conventional metrics. Combat simulations were scored on speed, accuracy, and adherence to protocol. Leadership opportunities went to those who could bark orders without hesitation and make split-second decisions without visible doubt. Hadley excelled in the classroom portions of training. Her tactical analyses were consistently the most thorough and insightful. Her weapons maintenance scores were perfect. Her navigation and survival skills testing put her in the top 10% of the program. But none of that mattered when she couldn't keep her composure during a firefight simulation. The cruel irony was that Hadley understood combat better than most of her peers. She'd grown up in Prague during the tail end of regional conflicts, had seen what violence actually looked like when it spilled into civilian areas. Her father had been a military engineer, her mother a trauma nurse. She'd been raised on stories of real warfare, not Hollywood versions or video game fantasies. The evaluation scores were posted every Friday morning outside the main training hall, a ritual that had become Hadley's weekly humiliation. She'd learned to arrive early, before the crowds gathered, to spare herself the public reading of her rankings. This particular Friday was no different. Her name sat firmly in the bottom quartile, marked in red to indicate at-risk status. "Still bringing up the rear, Glass," Webb's voice carried across the courtyard as he approached with his usual entourage. His scores, predictably, occupied the top tier in combat effectiveness and leadership potential. "Maybe you should consider a career change. I hear the base librarian is retiring." Hadley kept her eyes fixed on the bulletin board, studying the detailed breakdowns that others ignored. While Webb celebrated his high marks in marksmanship and physical fitness, she noticed patterns in the data that revealed more complex truths. The top performers were excelling in individual metrics, but struggling with team coordination. Their communication scores were mediocre. Their situational awareness ratings showed concerning gaps. Davis, Sergeant Major Thompson, appeared beside her, his scarred face impassive. "Report to my office after morning drills. We need to discuss your status in the program." The words sent ice through her veins, but Hadley nodded professionally. "Yes, Sergeant Major." As Thompson walked away, Webb leaned closer, his voice dropping to a mock whisper. "Looks like Glass is finally getting the boot. About time, really. This program's for warriors, not weepers." Kozlov joined the conversation with her characteristic bluntness. "Is cruel to let her continue. She weighs spot that could go to real soldier. In Russia, we would have removed her weeks ago." The morning drills were a disaster, as usual. The scenario involved urban combat simulation, with trainees divided into teams for building clearing exercises. Hadley found herself partnered with Reynolds, a Canadian paratrooper who'd drawn the short straw and was stuck with the program's weakest link. "Just stay behind me and try not to get in the way," Reynolds muttered as they approached their assigned building. "I'll handle the actual fighting." The simulation began with typical military chaos: smoke grenades, blank ammunition, and instructors playing enemy combatants with aggressive enthusiasm. Reynolds charged forward with textbook aggression, kicking down doors and shouting commands. Hadley followed, her weapon ready, but her mind processing details her partner missed entirely. The third room they entered looked empty. Reynolds swept it quickly and declared it clear, already moving toward the next objective. But Hadley noticed something: a slight displacement in the dust pattern near the far wall, suggesting recent movement. the positioning of furniture that could conceal someone lying prone, a faint shadow that didn't quite match the lighting. "Reynolds," she called softly, but he was already through the doorway. The simulated enemy combatant emerged from concealment a second later, eliminating Reynolds with a burst of blank fire. The exercise ended with their team marked as failed, another black mark against Hadley's record, despite the fact that her observation could have prevented the casualty. "Davis was right behind you," the instructor noted during debrief. "She saw the threat but didn't communicate effectively. Leadership failure." Reynolds shot her an angry look. "Next time, speak up louder. I can't read your mind." But Hadley had spoken up. She'd identified the threat correctly and attempted to warn her partner. The failure wasn't in her observation or her communication. It was in a system that didn't value subtle intelligence over aggressive action. After the drill, she retreated to her quarters to prepare for the meeting with Thompson. Her service record lay spread across her narrow bunk. 6 months of mediocre combat scores contrasted against exceptional marks in tactics, intelligence analysis, and technical proficiency. It painted the picture of someone who understood warfare intellectually but couldn't execute it practically. What the record didn't show was the private study she'd been conducting. Hidden in her footlocker, beneath regulation clothing and standard gear, was a collection of materials that would have surprised her critics. Advanced texts on psychological warfare, detailed analyses of successful unconventional military operations, historical studies of asymmetric conflicts where smaller forces defeated larger ones through superior intelligence and adaptation. She'd been particularly drawn to accounts of World War II resistance fighters, small teams that used intimate knowledge of local conditions to outmaneuver larger, better-equipped enemies. Their success came not from raw firepower or physical dominance, but from understanding human nature, reading situations correctly, and acting with precision rather than aggression. The assignment Thompson offered wasn't what Hadley expected. Instead of being transferred to intelligence analysis or kicked out of the program entirely, she found herself in a classified wing of Camp Ironforge she'd never known existed. The corridors here were different, quieter, with soundproofed walls and security doors that required biometric access. Colonel Miranda Hayes met her in a sterile briefing room that looked more like a corporate boardroom than a military facility. Hayes was in her 40s, with sharp eyes and an understated presence that somehow commanded more respect than all of Thompson's scars and decorations combined. "Ms. Davis," Hayes began, notably omitting military rank, "your psychological profile makes for interesting reading. High emotional intelligence, exceptional pattern recognition, ability to process multiple variables simultaneously. Most military minds see these as weaknesses. I see them as assets." The briefing that followed changed everything Hadley thought she knew about modern warfare. Hayes explained a classified program called Silent Storm, deep infiltration operations that required operatives who could blend into civilian populations, gather intelligence through human connection rather than technical surveillance, and neutralize threats through psychological manipulation rather than physical force. "We don't need soldiers who can kick down doors," Hayes continued. "We need chameleons who can walk through doors that others don't even know exist. People who can read a room in 30 seconds and adapt their entire personality to match what's needed." For the first time in months, Hadley felt hope stirring in her chest. This wasn't charity or a consolation prize. It was recognition that her differences might actually be valuable. The training that began the next day was unlike anything offered in the regular program. Instead of weapons drills and physical combat, she learned micro-expression analysis, voice stress detection, and cultural adaptation techniques. She studied psychology texts that taught her how to establish rapport with hostile subjects, how to detect deception through subtle behavioral cues, how to manipulate conversations to extract information without the subject realizing they were being interrogated. Her instructor was Captain David Chen, a soft-spoken operative who'd spent 5 years infiltrating terrorist cells in Southeast Asia.
Chen taught her that strength came in many forms, that the deadliest weapons were often the ones nobody saw coming. Your tears during combat training weren't weakness, Chen explained during one of their sessions. They were evidence of heightened emotional processing. In the field, that sensitivity will allow you to detect danger signals that other operatives miss entirely. While her former classmates continued with conventional military training, Hadley delved into a world of shadows and subtlety. She learned 6 languages well enough to pass for a native speaker. She mastered disguise techniques that could transform her appearance completely. Most importantly, she learned to weaponize the very traits that had made her seem weak. Her small stature, perfect for appearing non-threatening to targets who might be suspicious of imposing operatives. Her emotional sensitivity, invaluable for reading the psychological states of subjects under interrogation. Her tendency to cry under stress, an excellent cover for someone who needed to appear vulnerable and harmless. But the transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. For the first time since arriving at Camp Ironforge, Hadley felt like she was developing skills that matched her natural abilities instead of fighting against them. She threw herself into the training with an intensity that surprised even Chen. "You're studying 16 hours a day," he observed, during one of their psychological evaluations. "That's not sustainable long-term." "It doesn't feel like studying," Hadley replied honestly. "It feels like finally learning to speak my native language." 3 weeks into the Silent Storm training, Hayes called her for another private meeting. This time, the colonel's expression was more serious, tinged with something that might have been concern. "Your progress has been exceptional, Davis. Unprecedented, actually. But I need to ask you something directly. Are you doing this to prove yourself to the people who dismissed you, or because you genuinely believe in the mission?" The question caught Hadley off guard. She'd been so focused on finally finding success that she hadn't examined her motivations too closely. "Both, I think," she admitted. "I want to prove that they were wrong about me, but I also think this kind of work is important, maybe more important than what they're doing." Hayes nodded slowly. The desire for vindication can be a powerful motivator, but it can also compromise judgment. In this line of work, ego gets people killed. I need operatives who can put the mission above their personal feelings. That night, Hadley lay in her narrow bunk thinking about Hayes's warning. Was she pursuing this path because it was right for her, or because it was a way to get revenge on people who'd made her feel small? The distinction felt crucial, but also blurry. Meanwhile, back in the regular training program, her absence hadn't been unnoticed. Webb had started asking pointed questions about where she disappeared to, and Kozlov had made several comments about special treatment for failures. The official story was that she'd been transferred to advanced intelligence training, but the specifics were classified. "Probably learning how to file reports in alphabetical order," Webb sneered during one mess hall conversation that Hadley overheard. They had to find something she could handle without crying. The mockery stung, but it also reinforced her determination. She was learning skills that would make Webb's brute force approach look primitive, developing capabilities that Kozlov's aggressive tactics couldn't match. But she was also learning patience, the ability to endure mockery now because she knew something they didn't. Chen had taught her that the best intelligence operatives were often underestimated. He said, "Let people think you are weak. Let them dismiss you as irrelevant. Their blindness becomes your advantage." As her training intensified, Hadley began to understand that she wasn't becoming stronger in spite of her sensitivity. She was becoming dangerous because of it. Every trait that had made her seem unfit for conventional military service was being refined into a weapon that could cut deeper than any blade. Her emotional intelligence allowed her to manipulate targets without them realizing they were being manipulated. Her ability to cry on command gave her perfect cover for infiltration scenarios. Her small stature and delicate appearance made her invisible to enemies who were watching for traditional threats. But perhaps most importantly, her experience of being dismissed and underestimated had taught her how to read the psychology of dominance and weakness. She understood exactly how people like Webb and Kozlov thought, exactly what made them feel superior, exactly how to use their arrogance against them. The irony wasn't lost on her. her former tormentors, were unwittingly training her to defeat people exactly like themselves.
The mess hall buzzed with its usual evening energy as trainees decompressed from another brutal day of exercises. Hadley sat alone at a corner table, picking her dinner while listening to conversations that painted a clear picture of how her mysterious absence was being interpreted. "I heard Glass finally had a complete breakdown," Reynolds was telling a group of Canadian trainees. "Probably locked up in the psych ward getting therapy for her delicate feelings." "Would make sense," agreed Martinez, a Spanish Marine who'd never shown Hadley outright hostility, but had never shown her kindness either. "She was barely holding it together during urban combat sims. Remember that time she literally froze when the flashbangs went off?" Webb's voice carried over the background noise, loud enough that Hadley suspected he wanted her to hear it. "Best thing that could have happened, really. This program is designed to produce elite soldiers, not handholders for broken girls who can't handle reality." Kozlov's response was characteristically blunt. "In the Russian military, we do not waste time with psychological casualties. It's harsh, but necessary. Weak soldiers in combat get strong soldiers killed." What made the conversations particularly painful wasn't their cruelty. Hadley had endured months of that. It was their certainty. These people were absolutely convinced they understood what had happened to her, that her disappearance confirmed everything they'd believed about her fundamental inadequacy. Nobody questioned why someone deemed a psychological casualty would be assigned to continued training rather than discharged. Nobody wondered why her personal effects remained in her quarters, or why she was occasionally spotted in parts of the base they didn't frequent. They saw what they expected to see, and constructed explanations that reinforced their existing beliefs. Thompson appeared at her table without invitation, setting down his coffee with deliberate precision. "How are you adjusting to your new training regimen, Davis?" His presence immediately altered the energy in the mess hall. Conversations continued, but Hadley could sense ears tuning into their discussion. "Very well, Sergeant Major. The instruction has been illuminating." "I imagine it would be. Different approach entirely from what you were experiencing in the standard program." Thompson's tone was neutral, but Hadley caught the subtle emphasis on different. "Are you finding it more suited to your particular skill set?" "Yes, Sergeant Major. I feel like I'm finally being challenged in ways that matter." The exchange was brief and professional, but Hadley noticed how it was interpreted by nearby listeners. Thompson's questions could easily be understood as checking on someone who'd been transferred to remedial training, and her responses could be heard as making the best of a disappointing situation. After Thompson left, the speculation intensified. "Definitely psyche, Val," Webb declared with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his own conclusions. "Thompson's checking to make sure she's not going to snap completely and hurt herself or others." "Poor thing," said Sarah Mitchell, one of the other few women in the program. Her sympathy felt almost worse than Webb's mockery. "It must be so hard to realize you're not cut out for this kind of work. At least they're trying to help her transition to something more appropriate." Even Mitchell, who meant well, couldn't conceive that Hadley might be succeeding rather than failing. The narrative of her weakness had become so established that any evidence to the contrary was automatically reinterpreted to fit the existing story. The dismissive chorus wasn't limited to her fellow trainees. Over the following days, she encountered instructors from her former program who offered condescending encouragement that revealed their assumptions about her situation. "Don't feel bad about the transfer, Davis," said Lieutenant Morrison, one of her former tactical instructors. "Not everyone is meant for frontline operations. There's important work to be done in support roles." Master Sergeant Williams, who'd overseen weapons training, was even more direct. "Sometimes knowing your limitations is the most important lesson you can learn. Better to accept reality now than to fail when lives are on the line." Their kindness was meant to be supportive, but it felt like being patted on the head by people who were certain she was incapable of real achievement. They were trying to help her accept what they saw as inevitable defeat. But meanwhile, her actual training with Chen was progressing at a pace that amazed even her instructors. Her scores in psychological assessment were off the charts. Her language acquisition was happening so rapidly that they had to bring in additional specialists to keep up with her progress.
Her practical exercises in social manipulation were producing results that seasoned operatives found impressive. You have an intuitive understanding of human psychology that takes most people years to develop. It's like you've been studying people your entire life, Chen told her during one evaluation. In a way, she had been. Growing up as a sensitive child in a world that valued toughness had taught her to read microexpressions, to detect mood shifts, to understand the unspoken rules that govern social interactions. Her apparent weakness had actually been intensive training in human nature. But she couldn't share these victories with anyone. The classified nature of her training meant that her success was invisible to everyone except her handlers. As far as the wider base was concerned, she remained the same fragile girl who'd washed out of regular training.
Administrative duties at Camp Ironforge meant spending 8 hours a day in a windowless office, filing reports that nobody would ever read, and updating databases that tracked equipment nobody cared about. For Hadley, who'd spent months learning to analyze complex psychological profiles and plan sophisticated intelligence operations, the work felt like intellectual suffocation. But the mundane duties were the least of her problems. Word of her security investigation had spread through the base with the efficiency that only military gossip could achieve. The whispers followed her everywhere, turning her from an object of pity into something far worse, a subject of suspicion and fear. "I heard she was planning some kind of revenge against the people who failed her out of regular training," Reynolds murmured to a group of trainees during lunch, his voice just loud enough for Hadley to hear from her isolated table. Psychological warfare stuff, really creepy. Webb's reaction was more direct and more hostile. "I always said there was something off about her. All that studying and analyzing people. Normal soldiers don't do that. She was probably gathering intelligence on all of us, looking for weaknesses she could exploit." Even Sarah Mitchell, who'd once shown sympathy for Hadley's struggles, now kept her distance. "It makes sense, though, doesn't it?" she said to her lunch companions. "Someone who gets rejected from everything they try might eventually snap and decide to hurt the people they blame for their failures." The transformation of her reputation from weak to dangerous was complete and devastating. Where once people had dismissed her as irrelevant, now they watched her with the kind of wariness reserved for unstable individuals who might pose a genuine threat. Her former invisibility had been replaced by hypervisibility of the worst possible kind. The administrative office where she worked was staffed by Corporal Janet Hayes, a career administrator who'd spent 15 years processing paperwork and had developed strong opinions about the kind of people who ended up in her domain. Most of the soldiers who get reassigned here are either disciplinary problems or medical cases, Hayes explained on Hadley's first day. "You don't look injured, so I'm guessing you fall into the first category. Just so we're clear, I don't tolerate any drama or attitude problems in my office. You do your work, keep your head down, and maybe you can salvage something from whatever mess you created for yourself." The assumption of guilt was absolute and non-negotiable. Hayes had decided that anyone under security investigation must be guilty of something, and she structured their interactions accordingly. Every task assignment came with implied supervision, every casual question carried undertones of suspicion, every mistake was documented as potential evidence of continued problematic behavior. But the workplace hostility was manageable compared to the systematic isolation Hadley faced in other areas of base life. The mess hall conversations that stopped when she approached, the training activities she was no longer permitted to observe, the social gatherings she was clearly unwelcome at, all of it created a bubble of suspicion that followed her everywhere. The worst part was how reasonable it all seemed from everyone else's perspective. A soldier who had failed at regular training, then been removed from specialized training for psychological instability, then placed under security investigation for potentially dangerous motivations. Of course such a person should be watched carefully and kept at arm's length. The logic was impeccable, even if the underlying assumptions were wrong. Dr. Brennan's weekly counseling sessions became exercises in careful navigation around psychological traps.
Every question was designed to elicit evidence of instability or dangerous thinking patterns. Every answer was analyzed for signs of deception or manipulation. "How are you adjusting to your new assignment?" Brennan would ask, pen poised over her notepad like a weapon. "I'm focusing on doing the work I've been assigned as well as possible," knowing that any expression of frustration would be documented as evidence of poor attitude, while excessive positivity would be interpreted as manipulative false compliance. "Are you experiencing any feelings of resentment toward the personnel who reported concerns about your behavior?" "I understand that they were acting in what they believed to be the best interests of the unit. I don't blame them for their concerns." The responses were technically honest, but carefully crafted to avoid giving Brennan ammunition for her ongoing assessment. It was exactly the kind of psychological manipulation that Hadley had been trained to employ, which made her conscious of the irony as she executed it. Meanwhile, Colonel Marsh's investigation continued with methodical thoroughness. Personnel were interviewed about their interactions with Hadley, their observations of her behavior, their concerns about her psychological state and potential for violence. Each interview added new layers to a portrait of someone who was, at best, emotionally unstable, and at worst, potentially dangerous to her fellow soldiers. The most damning testimony came from people who'd barely interacted with her, but who felt obligated to contribute something to the investigation. Their observations filtered through the lens of suspicion, transformed normal behavior into evidence of concerning patterns. She was always watching people, not in a normal way, but like she was studying them, looking for weaknesses or something to use against them. I caught her reading psychology books in the library, not military psychology, but books about manipulation and social control. It seemed weird for someone in logistics training. Even her former instructors, who'd once praised her analytical abilities, now reframed their observations in more sinister terms. Lieutenant Morrison, who had taught her tactical analysis, told investigators that her questions had been unusually focused on psychological aspects of warfare, and that she'd shown concerning interest in methods of breaking enemy morale. The accumulated testimony painted a picture of someone whose intellectual curiosity and analytical nature had been systematically reinterpreted as evidence of manipulative and potentially dangerous psychological patterns. Every strength she'd tried to develop was being used as evidence against her. 3 weeks into her administrative assignment, Hadley received notice that Colonel Marsh wanted to conduct a final interview before submitting her report to higher command. The meeting would determine whether she faced formal disciplinary action, medical discharge for psychological unfitness, or some other resolution to her case. As she prepared for what might be her last official act as a soldier, Hadley realized that the system had succeeded in doing exactly what she'd once feared it would do. It had taken her desire to serve and transformed it into evidence that she was unfit to serve. Her dedication had become obsession, her intelligence had become manipulation, her sensitivity had become instability.
The emergency alarm shattered the pre-dawn quiet of Camp Ironforge at 04:23 hours, sending personnel scrambling from their bunks toward emergency stations. Hadley, who'd been awake since 0300 reviewing files in preparation for her final interview with Colonel Marsh, was among the first to reach the command center. The situation was unprecedented in scope and urgency. Intelligence reports indicated that a group of international terrorists had infiltrated the nearby village of Inverloch, taking hostages in the village school and demanding the release of imprisoned associates. The terrorists were believed to be part of a sophisticated network with connections to both domestic extremist groups and international terrorist organizations. What made the situation particularly complex was the nature of the hostages. The village school served as a boarding facility for children from diplomatic families stationed throughout Northern Europe. 23 children between the ages of 8 and 16 were trapped inside, along with 5 teachers and the school's administrative staff. Major Shaw's voice carried the tension of someone managing a crisis that could have international implications. The terrorists are demanding immediate release of prisoners from facilities in 3 different countries. They've given us a 12-hour deadline before they began executing hostages, starting with the children. The tactical challenges were enormous. The school building was a converted 18th-century manor house with thick stone walls that would make assault extremely dangerous. The terrorists had chosen their location with obvious tactical awareness. The building was surrounded by open ground that would expose any rescue attempt, and the multiple levels and rooms made it nearly impossible to neutralize all threats simultaneously. Thermal imaging shows at least 6 armed individuals inside, reported Captain Williams, the base intelligence officer. We've barricaded ourselves in different parts of the building, making coordinated assault problematic. We're also dealing with unknown explosives. They threaten to detonate the building if they detect any rescue attempt. But the most challenging aspect was the terrorists themselves. Initial communications suggested they were highly educated, psychologically sophisticated, and familiar with standard negotiation and rescue protocols. They'd anticipated conventional responses and structured their operation to neutralize traditional tactical approaches. These aren't typical extremists, Williams continued. Their psychological profiles suggest advanced training in counterintelligence and psychological warfare. They're using psychological pressure tactics on the hostages and negotiators that indicate professional-level understanding of human psychology. Colonel Hayes, despite her usual focus on classified operations, had been called in to consult on the crisis. Her assessment was grimmer than anyone wanted to hear. Standard hostage negotiation techniques aren't going to work here. These individuals have been trained to resist psychological pressure and to use our own protocols against us. They're anticipating every conventional approach we might employ. The assembled command staff represented the best military minds available at Camp Ironforge, but the combination of tactical and psychological challenges was beyond their collective expertise. Physical assault was too risky given the explosives and the children's safety. Negotiation was being systematically defeated by opponents who understood the techniques better than the negotiators themselves. As the morning progressed and the deadline drew closer, it became clear that conventional solutions were failing. The terrorists had successfully neutralized every standard approach, leaving the command team with increasingly desperate options that risked massive casualties among innocent civilians. It was during this growing desperation that Sergeant Major Thompson made an observation that changed everything. We need someone who understands psychological manipulation at their level, someone who can get inside their heads and find vulnerabilities they haven't prepared for. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the room knew that Camp Ironforge had been training someone with exactly those capabilities, someone who'd been removed from the program for being too good at psychological manipulation, too interested in finding and exploiting human weaknesses. Colonel Marsh, who'd spent weeks building a case against Hadley's psychological stability, found herself in the position of considering whether the very traits she deemed dangerous might be essential for resolving a crisis that threatened dozens of innocent lives. Davis has been studying psychological warfare and manipulation techniques intensively. Her psychological assessments indicate unusual ability to read people and situations. If anyone on this base could develop an unconventional approach to this situation, it would be her. Major Shaw's objection was immediate and practical. She's under security investigation for potentially dangerous psychological instability. How can we consider putting her in a position where those same concerns become operational risks? The debate that followed revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Hadley's situation. The same psychological traits that made her unsuitable for normal military service might make her uniquely qualified for a crisis that demanded unconventional solutions. Thompson's voice carried the weight of command authority when he finally spoke. The question isn't whether Davis has psychological issues. The question is whether those issues make her more or less likely to save those children's lives. As the deadline approached and conventional solutions continued to fail, the command team found themselves facing an impossible choice. They could continue pursuing standard protocols that weren't working, potentially resulting in the death of 28 innocent civilians, or they could gamble on the psychological insights of someone they deemed too unstable to trust. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Hadley had been removed from psychological operations training because her instructors worried she might use those skills inappropriately. Now they were considering whether those same inappropriate skills might be exactly what the situation required. At 0947 hours, with less than 3 hours remaining until the terrorists' deadline, Colonel Marsh made a decision that violated every security protocol she'd spent her career upholding. Bring Davis to the command center. If she's as psychologically dangerous as we believe she is, maybe it's time to point that danger at someone who actually deserves it. The words transformed Hadley from security threat to potential salvation, though whether that transformation represented desperation or wisdom remained to be seen. What was certain was that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of 28 innocent hostages, but the true measure of abilities that had been simultaneously feared and needed by the very people who had tried to suppress them.
Hadley entered the command center to find herself facing the same people who'd spent weeks questioning her psychological fitness and loyalty. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. The traits they deemed dangerous were now being viewed as potentially essential for saving innocent lives. Colonel Marsh's expression was unreadable as she gestured toward the tactical displays showing the school building. "Davis, we have a situation that requires unconventional approaches to psychological pressure. Given your specialized training and particular insights into human psychology, we're asking for your assessment." The words were carefully chosen to avoid acknowledging that they were essentially admitting the investigation had been wrong, while also not completely vindicating Hadley's psychological fitness. It was a political solution to a practical problem. But as Hadley studied the intelligence reports and communication transcripts from the terrorists, she realized the scope of what they were asking her to do. They wanted her to develop psychological profiles of individuals who were holding children at gunpoint, then devise strategies to manipulate those individuals into surrender or tactical mistakes. "The terrorists have been trained to resist standard negotiation techniques," Captain Williams briefed her. "They're anticipating our psychological approaches and countering them systematically. We need someone who can think beyond conventional protocols." Hadley analyzed the available information with the same intensity she'd once applied to her psychological operations training. The terrorists' communication patterns revealed sophisticated understanding of negotiation psychology, but also underlying personality structures that could be exploited by someone willing to use techniques that fell outside official protocols. "They're using textbook counter-interrogation methods," she observed after reviewing the transcripts, "but they're also revealing personal psychological vulnerabilities through their choice of pressure tactics and demand structures." Major Shaw leaned forward, her skepticism evident despite the crisis situation. "What kind of vulnerabilities?" "The leader shows signs of narcissistic personality structure with underlying insecurity about intellectual competence. He's overly focused on demonstrating psychological superiority over our negotiators. That need for validation could be exploited." Hadley continued her analysis, identifying patterns in the terrorists' behavior that suggested emotional triggers and psychological pressure points. But as she developed her assessment, she also became aware of the ethical implications of what she was being asked to do. "The approaches I'm identifying would require psychological manipulation techniques that fall outside standard military protocols. Some of them could be considered psychological torture if applied inappropriately." Colonel Marsh's voice carried the weight of command authority and moral complexity. "Davis, we have 28 innocent people, including 23 children, who will be executed in less than 3 hours if we can't resolve this situation. What are your recommendations?" The question forced Hadley to confront everything she'd struggled with during her psychological operations training. The techniques she'd learned could indeed save those children's lives, but using them would require her to become exactly the kind of psychologically manipulative individual that her instructors had worried she might become.
I can develop approaches that would likely force them into tactical errors or psychological surrender, she said quietly, but implementing those approaches would require me to use every psychological manipulation technique I've learned, applied with the specific intent of causing psychological distress and emotional breakdown. The command center fell silent, except for the periodic radio updates from negotiation teams who continued to make no progress with conventional approaches. Everyone present understood the moral complexity of what they were discussing. Thompson's voice broke the silence. Davis, in your professional assessment, what are the chances that conventional approaches will succeed before the deadline? Less than 10% based on the psychological profiles and their systematic countering of standard techniques. And what are the chances that your unconventional approaches would succeed? Hadley considered the question with the analytical precision her training had taught her. 70 to 80%, assuming I can implement them without interference and that the psychological profiles I've developed are accurate. Major Shaw asked the question that everyone was thinking. What would implementing these approaches require from us? Complete operational control over psychological aspects of the negotiation. No interference with my methods, even if they appear to violate standard protocols. And acceptance that saving those children's lives is more important than maintaining institutional comfort with my psychological techniques. The request was essentially asking for permission to use every controversial skill she'd developed, every manipulative technique that her instructors had worried she might become, every psychological weapon that the investigation had deemed potentially dangerous. She was asking them to trust her with exactly the capabilities they'd spent weeks arguing she couldn't be trusted with. Colonel Marsh looked around the room at her colleagues, reading the same desperate calculation in all their faces. Standard approaches weren't working. Time was running out. Children were going to die unless someone was willing to use methods that fell outside normal military protocols. "What do you need?" Marsh asked finally. "Direct communication access to the terrorists without monitoring or interference. 30 minutes to establish psychological rapport and begin implementing pressure techniques. And understanding that what you see me do may look like everything you've been worried about, but it's being applied to save innocent lives rather than settle personal scores." The distinction was crucial. The same psychological techniques that had made her seem dangerous when potentially directed at fellow soldiers might be exactly what was needed when directed at actual enemies who were threatening children's lives. Hadley felt the weight of the moment settling around her like a physical presence. This was the choice that would define not just her career, but her understanding of who she was and what her abilities were meant to accomplish. She could refuse the assignment and maintain the moral high ground while children died, or she could embrace the darkest aspects of her training to save innocent lives. "I'll do it," she said quietly, "but I need everyone in this room to understand that after this operation, you'll know exactly how psychologically dangerous I can be. If that's what it takes to bring those children home safely, then that's what I'll do." Colonel Marsh nodded grimly. "Davis, you're authorized to use whatever psychological methods you deem necessary. The children's lives are the only priority that matters." As communication equipment was prepared for her use, Hadley realized she was about to prove both her critics and her supporters correct simultaneously. She was, indeed, psychologically dangerous in ways that most soldiers weren't. But instead of being a liability, that danger was about to become the weapon that saved 28 innocent lives. The question wasn't whether she was too psychologically unstable for military service. The question was whether the military was ready to accept soldiers whose strengths didn't fit conventional categories of what military effectiveness looked like.
The breakthrough came at 11:34 hours when Pavel's psychological defenses finally collapsed under the systematic pressure Hadley had been applying. His voice cracked as he spoke, revealing the depth of emotional damage her carefully crafted attacks had inflicted on his mental state. "You don't understand what they took from me," he said, abandoning the intellectual superiority that had characterized his earlier communication. "My brother was just a student. He wasn't even involved in anything political. That killed him because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time." Hadley had successfully transformed him from a confident terrorist leader into a grieving brother whose pain was consuming his tactical judgment. But the victory created a new challenge. She now had to guide him toward surrender without pushing him into complete psychological breakdown that might result in violence against the hostages. "Pavel, I do understand," she replied, her tone shifting to carry genuine empathy that wasn't entirely manufactured. "I've seen the psychological profiles of people who've lost family members to institutional violence. The need for revenge becomes overwhelming, but it also becomes a trap that destroys the very people it's supposed to serve." The command center staff listened with growing amazement as Hadley demonstrated skills that transcended mere psychological manipulation. She was conducting a form of psychological surgery, dismantling Pavel's operational effectiveness while simultaneously offering him emotional paths toward surrender that preserved his dignity and psychological survival. "But here's what concerns me most. The children you're holding aren't responsible for what happened to your brother. They're innocent of any connection to the people who hurt you. Using them as tools for revenge against a system that failed you doesn't honor your brother's memory. It makes you complicit in the same kind of institutional violence that took his life." The argument struck at the core contradiction in Pavel's psychological framework. He'd constructed the operation as a form of justice for his brother's death, but Hadley was forcing him to confront the reality that he was becoming the same kind of person who'd killed an innocent student 3 years earlier. Pavel's response revealed the internal war her words had created. "What choice do I have? The system doesn't respond to anything except force. They only pay attention when innocent people are threatened." "You're right about the system," Hadley agreed, "but you're wrong about your choices. You've already demonstrated that you're intellectually superior to their negotiators. You've already proven that their security was inadequate and their responses predictable. You've made your point more effectively than any political manifesto could have accomplished." The conversation had shifted from psychological attack to something resembling genuine counseling, though Hadley's ultimate objective remained unchanged. She needed Pavel to release the hostages voluntarily, but she also needed to ensure that his surrender didn't trigger desperate actions from his team members. "Pavel, I want to propose something that might serve your brother's memory better than this operation can. What if instead of becoming another casualty of the same system that failed him, you become the person who proves that intelligence and moral courage can achieve more than violence and revenge?" Through her earpiece, Hadley could hear Colonel Marsh's voice providing tactical updates. Thermal imaging shows increased movement inside the building. The subjects appear to be having heated discussions among themselves. Whatever you're doing, it's creating internal pressure. The information confirmed that Pavel's psychological breakdown was affecting team cohesion, creating exactly the kind of tactical opportunities that conventional approaches hadn't been able to generate. But it also meant that time was critically short. If Pavel couldn't maintain control over his team, the situation could deteriorate into unpredictable violence against innocent children. "Pavel, I need to ask you something important. Are your team members psychologically prepared for the kind of emotional pressure you're experiencing right now? Because if they're not, your operation could spiral into chaos that serves nobody's interests." The question forced Pavel to confront a reality he'd been avoiding. His team members weren't driven by the same personal motivations that sustained his commitment to the operation. They were following his leadership, but that leadership was becoming increasingly compromised by his psychological breakdown. "Some of them are getting nervous," Pavel admitted. "They joined for political reasons, but they weren't prepared for the emotional reality of holding children hostage for hours." "Then you have a choice to make," Hadley replied. "You can continue this operation until your team's psychological state becomes unstable and unpredictable, potentially resulting in violence against innocent children,
Or you can end this as the intellectual and moral superior who proved his point without becoming the kind of monster who hurts innocents. The final psychological pressure was perfectly calibrated to exploit Pavel's narcissistic need for intellectual superiority while offering him a path toward surrender that preserved his self-image as someone morally superior to the system he was fighting. At 11:47 hours, Pavel made the decision that saved 28 innocent lives. "I want to negotiate terms for release of the hostages," he said quietly, "but I want to speak directly with military commanders, not political representatives. I want them to acknowledge that their security was inadequate and that changes will be made to prevent similar situations." The request was easily accommodated. Within minutes, Colonel Marsh was speaking directly with Pavel, accepting his terms and arranging for the safe release of all hostages in exchange for guarantees of fair treatment for the terrorists and public acknowledgement of security failures. As the children and teachers emerged from the school building and the terrorists surrendered without violence, the command center staff stared at Hadley with a mixture of awe and unease. She'd accomplished something that conventional military training had deemed impossible, using psychological techniques that fell far outside normal protocols. But perhaps more importantly, she'd done it without compromising her own psychological integrity. The same emotional sensitivity that had made her seem weak during regular military training had allowed her to navigate the moral complexities of psychological manipulation while preserving both her effectiveness and her humanity. Colonel Marsh's voice carried new respect when she addressed Hadley directly. "Davis, that was the most sophisticated psychological operation I've ever witnessed. You saved 28 innocent lives using nothing but words and an understanding of human psychology that exceeded everyone's expectations." The acknowledgement felt like vindication, but Hadley also understood that her demonstration of psychological capability had fundamentally changed how she would be perceived by military authorities. She was no longer the fragile soldier who couldn't handle combat stress. She was someone whose mind was a weapon more dangerous than any conventional military equipment.
6 months later, Hadley stood in the same briefing room where she'd once been relegated to equipment manifests and dismissed as too weak for real missions. But everything had changed. The search and rescue patch on her shoulder had been replaced by the distinctive insignia of Psychological Operations Command. And when she spoke, the assembled officers listened with the kind of attention reserved for recognized experts. The key to successful psychological operations isn't the ability to manipulate people, she told the group of military psychologists and intelligence officers who'd come to learn from her methods. It's the ability to understand them so completely that manipulation becomes unnecessary. When you truly comprehend someone's psychological framework, you can guide them toward decisions that serve both their needs and your objectives. The lecture was part of her new role as the military's leading specialist in advanced psychological warfare. The same techniques that had once been viewed as evidence of dangerous instability were now being studied and systematized for use by other operatives. But the transformation hadn't been without costs. The investigation that had nearly destroyed her career was officially closed with a finding that her psychological profile was uniquely suited for specialized operations requiring exceptional emotional intelligence and psychological insight. The language was carefully crafted to avoid admitting that months of investigation had been based on fundamental misunderstandings of her capabilities. Colonel Marsh, who now served as Hadley's commanding officer, had become one of her strongest advocates. Davis represents the evolution of modern warfare, she'd written in her final report. Traditional metrics of military effectiveness are insufficient for evaluating soldiers whose primary weapons are intellectual and psychological rather than physical. The hostage situation had become a case study taught at military academies throughout NATO, though the classified nature of psychological operations meant that most students learned only the broad outlines of how the crisis had been resolved. The full details of Hadley's psychological manipulation techniques remained restricted to personnel with appropriate security clearances. Webb and Kozlov, who'd once dismissed her as glass, now treated her with the kind of wary respect typically reserved for dangerous explosives.
They'd finally understood that her emotional sensitivity hadn't been weakness. It had been the foundation for psychological capabilities that exceeded their own by orders of magnitude. "I never understood what you were capable of," Webb had told her during a chance encounter in the mess hall. "I thought crying during training made you weak. I didn't realize you were processing emotional information that the rest of us couldn't even detect." The apology was sincere, but it also revealed the limited understanding that most soldiers had of psychological warfare. They could accept that Hadley possessed valuable skills, but they couldn't fully comprehend the nature of those skills or the training required to develop them. Even more satisfying was the transformation of her relationship with Thompson, who'd evolved from skeptical supervisor to mentor and advocate. "You've proven that military effectiveness comes in forms that conventional training doesn't recognize," he'd said during her promotion ceremony. "The question for the rest of us is whether we're wise enough to identify and cultivate those forms when we encounter them." But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from the children she'd saved. 3 months after the hostage crisis, she'd received a package containing 23 handwritten letters from the diplomatic children who'd been trapped in that school building. The letters were simple expressions of gratitude, but they represented proof that her psychological manipulations had served genuinely important purposes rather than personal ambitions. "Dear Soldier Lady," one of the letters began, "thank you for talking to the scary man so he would let us go home. My mom says you're a hero who uses words instead of guns. I think that's very smart, because words don't hurt people the way guns do." The child's observation captured something profound about the nature of psychological warfare and its potential for both good and evil. Words could indeed be more powerful than weapons, but that power carried corresponding responsibilities that conventional military training didn't address. As Hadley prepared to leave Camp Ironforge for her new assignment at Psychological Operations Command, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from dismissed failure to recognized expert. The same emotional sensitivity that had made her seem unfit for conventional military service had become the foundation for capabilities that save lives and resolve conflicts that physical force couldn't touch. Her story had become proof that strength came in many forms, that intelligence could be more valuable than aggression, and that the military's understanding of effectiveness needed to evolve to accommodate soldiers whose weapons were psychological rather than physical. But most importantly, she'd learned that being underestimated was often an advantage rather than a disadvantage. People who dismissed her as weak or unstable revealed their own limitations more clearly than any psychological profile could have documented. As her transport helicopter lifted off from Camp Ironforge, Hadley looked down at the base where she'd once been called glass and seen as too fragile for real military service. Now she was leaving as someone whose mind was considered a strategic asset, whose psychological insights were sought by intelligence agencies across the alliance, whose emotional sensitivity had been refined into one of the most sophisticated psychological warfare capabilities in modern military history. The girl who'd cried during combat training had become a woman whose tears could be weaponized when necessary, whose empathy could be deployed like precision munitions, whose understanding of human psychology could resolve crises that conventional force couldn't touch. She'd proven that being different wasn't the same as being weak, that emotional intelligence was a form of strength that deserved recognition alongside physical courage, and that the military's greatest asset might be soldiers who thought and felt differently rather than those who conformed to traditional expectations. The helicopter banked toward her new assignment, carrying someone who'd transformed from the weakest link in her unit to one of the most valuable psychological warfare specialists in NATO. Her journey had proved that limitations were often nothing more than failures of imagination, and that the most dangerous soldiers might be the ones nobody saw coming. Looking ahead toward new challenges and opportunities to serve, Hadley smiled at the irony of her transformation. They called her glass because they thought she would break under pressure. Instead, she'd learned to use that same pressure to reshape the world around her, one mind at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.